What's up, Warriors of Hope? Welcome to English Story School. Part 1. The Unexpected Question. What would you do if one decision, one heartbeat of courage, could rewrite the destiny of not just another person, but your own life forever? Would you take that leap, or would you step back into the shadows and let the moment slip away? It was a night drenched in rain. The kind of rain that feels like the sky is punishing the earth, pounding relentlessly as if it wants to wash away every secret hidden in the dark. Streets were nearly deserted, save for the occasional headlights slicing through the downpour. Sarah's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes squinting against the blur of wipers barely keeping up with the storm. She wasn't supposed to be here. She had taken a wrong turn after leaving work late, a small mistake that would put her exactly where fate needed her to be. Her thoughts were scattered, floating between exhaustion and the heavy silence of her car. But then it happened. Out of nowhere, a figure emerged from the shadows, stumbling, staggering, and collapsing right into the middle of the road. The screech of her brakes ripped through the rain as her car skidded to a violent stop, just inches away from the man's fragile body. Her chest tightened. Her heart pounded. In those seconds that felt like hours, every voice in her mind screamed at her, "Don't get out. Don't get involved. It's late. It's dangerous. Just drive away." Fear was clawing at her ribs, whispering the easy way out. But then came another voice, quieter yet louder in her soul. "If not me, then who?" That single whisper wasn't just a thought, it was a spark. Sparks are strange. They don't ask permission, they ignite without warning, and they can burn through a lifetime of hesitation in an instant. Sarah pushed open the door, rain soaking her within seconds. The cold cut into her skin, but adrenaline drowned everything else out. She ran toward the stranger. His clothes were drenched, his face pale, his eyes half shut as if he had already surrendered. She bent down, shaking his shoulders. "Hey, can you hear me? Stay with me." He groaned faintly, but his body was limp. The sight clawed at Sarah's insides. This wasn't just a man who had fallen. This was a soul on the edge, dangling between life and death. She could have stayed in her car. She could have justified leaving. But something deeper told her that this night wasn't random, and this man wasn't just a stranger. He was the reason she was here. Courage doesn't wait for the perfect time, Sarah remembered once reading. It demands action in the most imperfect of moments. She pulled him away from the road, dragging him through the mud and rain, her arms trembling under his weight. Every second felt heavier, her breath ragged, but she didn't stop. Finally, she laid him down by the sidewalk, kneeling beside him, staring into his exhausted face. "Come on, fight with me," she muttered, shaking his hand. "You don't get to quit tonight. Not here. Not now." The man's eyes flickered open for a brief second, and in them, she saw something that broke her heart. Emptiness. Not fear, not pain, but pure emptiness. The look of someone who had given up long before his body collapsed. She had never seen eyes like that before. Eyes that had once hoped, but no longer believed. Rain kept falling, and the world felt like it had shrunk to just the two of them. Her desperate persistence and his fading will. "Why me?" Sarah whispered under her breath, not sure if she was asking herself or the heavens. Why did I have to be the one here tonight? And then she realized the answer, because no one else was. Lightning flashed above, thunder cracked through the sky, and in that cinematic chaos, Sarah understood something profound. Destiny doesn't knock politely. It crashes into your life when you least expect it, demanding a response, demanding a choice. And that night, her choice was clear. She dialed for help, but she didn't let go of his hand. Her voice shook as she spoke, but her grip was steady. She leaned close to his ear and said, "I don't know who you are, but I refuse to let this be your last night. You are not leaving this world like this. Not while I'm here." There was no dramatic reply, no miraculous recovery in that instant. But there was a shift, not in him yet, but in her. Sarah felt something awaken, a fire she didn't even know she carried. She wasn't just saving a stranger. She was saving the part of herself that had always doubted her own courage, her own power to matter. And in that raw, rain-soaked moment, she learned a truth most people run from. Sometimes you're not given the time to prepare to be strong. Sometimes you are thrown into a storm, and you only discover your strength by standing in it. As the ambulance sirens finally broke through the storm in the distance, Sarah stayed locked in the moment, drenched and trembling, but unshakably alive. She knew nothing about this man, not his name, not his past, not his story. But she knew this. Her life had just changed forever. And the strangest part? She didn't fear that change. She welcomed it. Because deep inside, she knew this was just the beginning. Part 2. The Stranger. The man's name was Daniel. Sarah didn't know it yet, but soon that name would etch itself into her memory like fire. When she first pulled him to safety, drenched in rain and shivering, he seemed less like a man and more like a shadow of someone who had once lived fully. His clothes clung to his body, torn in places, and his lips trembled from the cold. But his eyes told a story no words could capture. They were storm clouds, not of that night alone, but of years, maybe decades, of battles no one else had dared to fight with him. As the ambulance lights flickered in the distance, Sarah kept her grip on his hand. He was barely conscious, his breath shallow, but when he finally spoke, his voice carried a rawness that pierced through the roar of the rain. Why did you stop for me? No one else ever does." The simplicity of the question shattered something inside her. She could feel the weight behind those words. How many people had walked past him? How many had looked the other way, choosing comfort over compassion? Sarah's throat tightened. Her answer came not from thought, but from instinct, like truth rushing to the surface. Because everyone deserves one person who believes in them, even a stranger. The words hung in the air like a promise. In that moment, she saw a flicker in his expression, a faint crack in the wall of hopelessness he had built around himself. Something shifted, not only in him, but in her too. She had no idea who he was, no idea where he came from, or what darkness had dragged him to this night. Yet she sensed that her choice to act had set fire to a chain of events that neither of them could escape. The paramedics arrived quickly, lifting him onto a stretcher, but Daniel's gaze never left Sarah. His eyes, though heavy, held on to her as if anchoring himself to the only person who had seen him as more than a burden. She followed the ambulance to the hospital, drenched clothes clinging to her skin, her car forgotten in the storm. Inside the bright, sterile walls of the ER, Sarah sat in the waiting area, restless, her hands clasped tightly together. She should have left. This wasn't her responsibility. And yet something inside whispered, "This is only the beginning." After what felt like hours, a nurse finally told her he was stable but exhausted. Sarah hesitated before stepping into the dimly lit room. Daniel lay on the bed, hooked up to fluids, his chest rising and falling slowly. His face, though weary, looked less ghostly now. His eyes opened when he sensed her presence. "You're still here," he muttered, voice rough. "Yes," Sarah replied softly. "I couldn't just leave." He laughed bitterly, a laugh that carried more pain than joy. "People always leave. That's the only thing I can count on." Sarah pulled up a chair beside him, her expression steady, bold. "Maybe that changes tonight." He turned his face toward her, studying her like she was something foreign, a puzzle he couldn't piece together. After a pause, he whispered, "Do you even know what you've done? Saving me wasn't a gift. It was a curse, because now I'll owe you, and I have nothing left to give." Sarah leaned closer, her voice unwavering, filled with fire. "You don't owe me anything. Survival isn't a debt. It's an opportunity. And whether you like it or not, you've got another chance." For a long moment, silence filled the room, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. Then, almost reluctantly, Daniel's lips curled into the faintest, almost invisible smile. "Maybe you're crazier than I am," he said. Sarah shrugged lightly, though her voice carried weight. "Maybe, but sometimes it takes a little bit of crazy to do the right thing." That night, they spoke in fragments. Daniel revealed little, hints of battles with addiction, years of failure, family gone, dreams shattered. He didn't spill everything, but Sarah could feel the depth of his scars. Every broken sentence carried a history of loneliness, rejection, and silent wars. She didn't push him. She only listened. "Do you believe people can come back?" Daniel finally asked, his voice cracking under the weight of hope he was afraid to have. "Yes," Sarah answered without hesitation, "because people aren't defined by how far they've fallen, but by how many times they stand again." He closed his eyes, as if letting those words sink into a place that had long been sealed shut. And for the first time in years, maybe decades, Daniel didn't feel invisible. Sarah stayed by his side until dawn began to break through the blinds. She didn't know why she felt so tethered to him, this stranger whose life nearly ended in front of her car. All she knew was that her life had changed the moment she slammed her brakes on that rainy street. And though she couldn't explain it, she knew deep down this wasn't chance. This was purpose. "Sometimes," Sarah whispered to herself as the first rays of light cut across the room, "fate doesn't ask for permission. It just hands you someone's story and dares you to be a part of it." In that hospital room, a fragile bond had been forged, not out of obligation, not out of pity, but out of something greater. It was as if life itself had thrown them together to test whether compassion could resurrect a broken soul. And though Sarah had no way of knowing where this path would lead, she could feel it. A storm had passed, but another was coming. A storm that would test not just Daniel's strength, but hers as well. Because saving a stranger wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of a journey neither of them could ever walk away from. Part 3. The Hidden Battle. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah began to see the pieces of Daniel's life unravel before her eyes. He wasn't just a man who had collapsed on a rainy road. He was a fighter scarred by years of disappointments. His dreams had once been vivid, ambitions of building a business, traveling the world, making a name for himself. But those dreams had been crushed beneath betrayals, rejections, and endless failures that convinced him he was cursed to lose. At first, Daniel resisted opening up. His pride was wounded, his trust shattered. But Sarah's persistence chipped away at his walls. She wasn't asking for perfection, only honesty. And slowly, painfully, he began to share. He spoke of family who turned away when he stumbled, friends who vanished the moment he could no longer give, opportunities that slipped through his hands no matter how hard he fought. It's like the world's been keeping score against me, he confessed one night, his voice raw. Sarah leaned forward, eyes burning with conviction. The world may break you down, but it's your choice whether you stay down. Strength isn't about never falling. It's about rising every single time you do. Those words hit him harder than any storm. For years, he had defined himself by failure, by the weight of defeat. But Sarah's fire gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time, permission to try again. And so, Daniel began to rise. Not with grand leaps, but with fragile, stubborn steps. He signed up for counseling, sought small jobs, forced himself to look people in the eye again. It was messy, it was painful, but he was moving. Courage, Sarah reminded him, isn't loud. Sometimes it's just the whisper that says, try one more time. What Sarah didn't realize, however, was that as Daniel rebuilt piece by piece, he was also reconstructing her. She had always struggled with self-doubt, with questioning whether her kindness mattered, whether she was strong enough to leave an imprint on the world. Watching Daniel fight back from the edge showed her a reflection of her own power. Late one evening, after Daniel shared a small victory, getting through a day without spiraling into despair, Sarah found herself quietly crying. When Daniel asked why, she admitted, because I never thought I could change anything. But helping you has made me see I'm capable of more than I ever believed. Daniel smiled, faint but genuine. Maybe we're saving each other. From that moment, their journey was no longer one-sided. It wasn't just Sarah carrying Daniel. It was two souls, scarred and imperfect, lifting each other in ways they never imagined. And though the battles ahead would be fierce, they both knew now they weren't fighting alone. Part 4. The spark that changed everything. Months had passed since the rain-slicked night, and Daniel had become something neither of them expected. A voice. He began small, a handful of gatherings at a community center, a tentative 5-minute testimony at a shelter, a short talk at a school assembly. And each time he stepped up, his hands shook and his voice cracked, but the truth in his words landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward. He refused the label of hero. He called himself a man who survived. And in that humility, there was power. People leaned in because they recognized something honest, not performed. I won't sell you a miracle, he would say, and then tell them how he learned to get out of bed on bad mornings, how he found a way to answer the phone instead of shutting down, how small rituals kept him tethered. Those practical truths felt like life rafts to listeners who had been drowning. Sarah sat in the back of one of his larger talks, trying to be invisible. She had imagined pride as the main feeling, but the reality was stranger, a fierce, soft ache that filled her with both joy and a quiet disbelief. Watching him speak in that steady, imperfect way made her realize how fragile a person can be and how one small act of bravery could alter more than one life. She thought, kindness is the smallest revolution, and the sentence felt like a promise she could carry forward. The room pulsed with attention. There were heads bowed, shoulders trembling, and more than once a hand reached secretly for another hand squeeze. Invitations came slowly at first, then more insistently. A social worker recommended him for a counseling initiative. A teacher invited him to speak to students who had dropped out and were teetering on the edge. A small cafe offered him quiet afternoons to write and prepare. Each opportunity nudged him to translate private survival into public service. He taught routines for mornings when the bed felt like a trap, short sentences people could speak to themselves on panic nights, and tiny rituals. A single glass of water, a breath-counting exercise, that became the scaffolding for returning to life. People left his sessions with tools, not platitudes. They left with a plan they could practice in the dark. The ripples were immediate and human. A woman left a meeting and called the sister she had not seen in a decade. A young man who had refused job interviews for fear of rejection walked out and applied that afternoon. A volunteer at a nearby shelter completed a certification course she'd been postponing. Notes of thanks arrived like secret prayers, and each one felt to Sarah like proof. Her stop on that rainy road had multiplied into 100 quiet rescues. One message read, "One small light can shatter a long night," and she taped it in her wallet because it felt true. But transformation was not a tidy miracle. Daniel's progress had nights of tremor and relapse. There were phone calls in the dark, when shadows tightened and his voice turned small. "I thought I'd already lost myself," he would confess, trembling. Sarah learned to answer those calls differently. She stopped trying to fix him and started offering steady company. Presence became her craft, listening without rushing to solutions, sitting with his fear until the panic eased. Her role shifted from rescuer to witness. That difference healed in ways she hadn't expected. When Daniel partnered with a local nonprofit to run weekend workshops, the first session nearly collapsed under his panic. He stumbled through a guided exercise, lulled into a silence that felt like failure. Then a woman in the front stood and spoke through tears. She had mailed a letter to a child she hadn't seen in years. The room inhaled, something in the air shifted. Daniel realized the measure of success wasn't applause. It was when someone did the next brave thing in private after hearing his story. That realization steadied him more than any compliment ever could. Between public talks and private calls, there were dozens of small, tangible victories. He helped a former coworker reconnect with a teenage son after years of coldness. He volunteered at a soup kitchen, chopping vegetables and handing out trays with the same hands that had once trembled in the rain. People began to speak his name with gratitude. He would blink back tears and say, "I did the only thing that felt honest. I told the truth about where I'd been." He guarded himself against pedestal making. Humility kept his voice real and reachable. For Sarah, witnessing Daniel's resurrection became a mirror. She had always been the kind of person who helped quietly because she simply could not look away. But watching how that single act of compassion multiplied into a network of care taught her a new metric for worth. Consistency over heroics. Small text to check in, the way she sat through uncomfortable silences, how she refused to let an anxious plea go unanswered. These slow, simple acts shifted something in her. Confidence arrived not as thunder, but as steady light. She found herself imagining futures that didn't require proving herself every day. One chilly evening after a packed session, a woman pressed a folded note into Sarah's hand. "My brother listened," she said, voice shaking with relief and laughter at once. "He called a helpline. He's making an appointment." The note was brief but heavy with consequence. Sarah felt, for the first time fully, the circumference of that consequence. A single stop in a storm had threaded into a map of rescue for people she would never meet. By then, the spark had become culture, not a tidy movement, but a messy, insistently human practice of noticing. Neighbors checked on neighbors. Volunteers grew into mentors. People who had once felt invisible were invited into conversation and work. It wasn't perfect, and it did not erase scars. Instead, it offered pathways through them, small, stubborn bridges built by ordinary people who kept showing up. Backstage before a talk that drew more people than either had imagined, Daniel paused and looked toward the crowd. He found Sarah's face and offered a small, steady smile. They shared a private, wordless understanding. The miracle wasn't that one life had been saved. The miracle was that saving continued. It multiplied, teaching a town to call, to stay, to listen. And in that growing light, they both realized something true and fierce, that one brave decision, taken in the dark, can spark 1,000 small lights that refuse to go out. Part 5. The Legacy of One Choice. Their bond became something unshakable, not bound by the cliches of romance or by the fantasy of storybooks, but by something far more rare, truth. They weren't heroes wearing capes. They weren't saints born to inspire. They were just two people, two fragile souls, who had collided on a rain-soaked night and reminded the world of what it really means to be human. And isn't that what the world needs most? Humanity? Sarah's single act of courage had not only saved Daniel, it had rippled outwards in ways neither of them could have imagined. Daniel's talks grew larger. First, a dozen listeners in a cramped community hall, then hundreds filling theaters, then thousands watching his videos online. He didn't speak like a polished motivational speaker. He spoke like a man who had bled, who had walked through fire and somehow found his way out. That authenticity made him unstoppable. Everywhere he went, people whispered his story. That's the man who almost gave up, and the woman who wouldn't let him. And each time the story was told, Sarah's choice grew into a living legend. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about every person who ever thought of giving up. It was about the strangers who realized maybe, just maybe, someone would stop for them too. Sarah never stood on stage beside him, but her presence was always there. Sometimes, sitting in the audience, she would hear people cheer, cry, or whisper thanks, and she would feel a strange mix of humility and pride. She knew the truth. All of this started because she made a choice in a single second, a choice that could have been so easy to ignore. One evening, after a particularly powerful talk, Daniel and Sarah walked through a quiet park. The stars were scattered above like broken glass, and the air smelled of rain, as if reminding them of that night when it all began. Daniel stopped, looked at her, and said with a weight in his voice, "Do you ever realize what you've done? Not just for me, but for everyone who hears this story." Sarah shook her head, her smile soft but firm. I didn't do anything extraordinary. I just did what I hoped someone would do for me if I was in your place." Daniel's reply was immediate, powerful, and that's what makes it extraordinary. Because most people don't. Most people keep driving. Her heart tightened at his words. He was right. That's why her decision mattered. She had chosen the harder path, the path of involvement, of responsibility, of humanity. And that one act had multiplied into thousands of lives touched, healed, and reignited. The lesson was undeniable, echoing like thunder through everything they had built together. Never underestimate the power of a single choice, a single word, a single moment. Because one spark, if protected, if believed in, can light up the entire darkness. Sarah often shared her philosophy with those who asked why she stopped that night. Her answer never changed. Be the reason someone decides not to give up today. It wasn't just a phrase, it was a way of living. And people carried her words with them, scrawling them in journals, printing them on posters, whispering them into the ears of friends who were breaking. In time, Sarah and Daniel's story spread far beyond their city. Newspapers wrote about them. Documentaries were made. Schools invited Daniel to speak. And in those classrooms, children who felt invisible began to see hope. If he could survive, maybe I can too, they thought. But through all the recognition and noise, they both stayed grounded in one truth. This wasn't about fame or attention. It was about the sacred weight of choices. The choice to stop when others drive by. The choice to speak life instead of silence. The choice to believe in a stranger when the world has abandoned them. Years later, Sarah sat in her small apartment, watching one of Daniel's recorded speeches. He was older now, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. His voice carried across the screen. Sometimes, in saving a stranger, you discover the greatest gift of all, the strength to save yourself. Sarah leaned back, tears welling in her eyes, whispering the question that had started it all. What would you do if one choice could change everything? Would you step up? Would you stop? Would you save? The answer was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who heard their story. Because by now, thousands have been inspired to act, to step into someone else's storm, to risk being the light in the darkness. That was the legacy of one choice. Not just Daniel's survival, not just Sarah's courage, but the chain of lives that had been changed forever because on one rainy night, one woman whispered, "If not me, then who?" And the echo of that whisper still burns in the hearts of those who dare to believe that a single act of humanity can change the world. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.